What if I told you one airplane helped launch FedEx, hunted drug smugglers, flew through zero gravity, tested a fighter engine with an actual afterburner, and still managed to spend decades carrying CEOs to board meetings? Because somehow, all of those airplanes were exactly the same model. Most stories have another side. This one's just a little stranger. I'm Bill, and this is Buffalo Air Park. Let's dive in. After I published my video about Bill Lear and the Lear jet, several viewers suggested I take a closer look at one of its biggest competitors, the Dassault Falcon 20. I thought I knew the airplane. Turns out, I only knew the brochure. Because if the Lear jet became famous for speed and style, the Falcon 20 quietly built a resume that almost no other business jet can match. The story begins in France during the early 1960s. Marcel Dassault wasn't simply an aircraft manufacturer. He was already one of Europe's premier fighter designers. During World War II, he refused to cooperate with the Nazis and survived imprisonment in a concentration camp. After the war, he rebuilt both his company and his life, adopting the name Dassault inspired by his brother's French resistance codename. His philosophy was wonderfully simple. For an aircraft to fly well, it must be beautiful. And looking at the airplane that followed, it's hard to argue with him. Originally called the Mystère 20, it wore sleek swept wings, engines mounted at the rear, and proportions that looked much closer to one of Dassault's military fighters than a typical executive transport. It was elegant, but it was also incredibly tough. And that's where this story starts getting interesting. Now here's something I didn't know. Dassault understood that selling airplanes in America would be critical, but there was one small problem. The name. The company's marketing people worried Americans would look at Mystère and simply call it the Mr. 20. Fortunately, Pan American World Airways had become interested in the airplane, and airline president Juan Trippe had another idea. During a conversation with Henry Ford II, the name Falcon entered the conversation, borrowed from Ford's popular automobile. Just like that, the Mystère 20 became the Fanjet Falcon, and eventually, simply the Falcon 20. Pan Am wasn't just placing an order. They sent Charles Lindbergh himself to France to inspect the prototype. After evaluating the airplane, Lindbergh reportedly sent a remarkably short telegram back to Pan Am. "I found our bird." That endorsement led to an order of 40 aircraft. Not bad for an airplane that had barely introduced itself. Now, here's where Dassault's fighter experience really paid off. Unlike many business jets of the era, the Falcon wasn't designed right on the edge of its structural limits. It featured fully powered hydraulic controls backed up by mechanical systems. Lose the hydraulics, and the pilots could still physically fly the airplane. Its stall characteristics were so well behaved that it didn't require some of the automatic protection systems becoming common elsewhere. Even more remarkable, Dassault never established a certified structural life limit for the airframe itself. Talk about designing with a healthy safety margin. But perhaps the Falcon's greatest contribution had nothing to do with corporate travel. It helped create FedEx. In the early 1970s, Fred Smith had an ambitious idea for overnight package delivery, but he needed airplanes that were fast, reliable, and available at the right price. A recession created the perfect opportunity. Smith purchased dozens of surplus Falcon 20s and had them converted into freighters by cutting enormous cargo doors into the fuselage and strengthening the cabin floor. That sounds terrifying when you say it out loud. Let's cut a gigantic hole in a perfectly good business jet. But it worked. The Falcon became the backbone of Federal Express during its earliest years, and the company's very first operational jet, named Wendy, now rests in the Smithsonian. Without the Falcon 20, FedEx probably looks very different today. Most airplanes would be content with that legacy. The Falcon was apparently just getting warmed up. The U.S. Coast Guard purchased 40 of them, redesignating them the HU-25 Guardian. Instead of carrying executives, they hunted smugglers, patrolled coastlines, conducted search and rescue missions, and even deployed to the Persian Gulf during Operation Desert Storm to monitor massive oil spills. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Falcons found themselves towing aerial targets and supporting electronic warfare training for the Royal Navy. One incident almost sounds too unbelievable to be true. During a live fire exercise, a Falcon 20 was towing a target behind it on 23,000 feet of steel cable. That's more than 4 miles. The Falcon was flying at 1,700 feet and 300 knots, while the cable sloped all the way down to the target at just 40 feet above the water. When the warship hit the target, the Falcon violently yawed. The crew immediately fired the hydraulic cable cutter, but about 30 feet of the cable remained attached to the underwing winch. That piece whipped back into the slipstream and became jammed between the elevator and the horizontal stabilizer. Now they had a steel cable wedged directly into the airplane's tail controls, and somehow the Falcon kept flying. The crew declared an emergency, avoided using the flaps so the loose cable wouldn't become tangled in them, and safely landed. No injuries. And despite a steel cable being jammed into the tail, the Falcon's hydraulic control systems never lost authority. At this point, you start wondering what these things couldn't survive. Apparently, the answer wasn't afterburners. Because yes, someone actually installed one. In 1988, engineers converted a Falcon 20 into a flying engine testbed by replacing one of its standard engines with an experimental afterburning turbofan. Not two, just one. So, imagine taxiing out and seeing a perfectly respectable business jet with one engine behaving normally, while the other is shooting a giant plume of fire like an F-16. The airplane reached Mach 1 during testing. It's probably the only corporate jet in history that looked equally comfortable parked beside Gulfstreams or fighter aircraft. And somehow, the Falcon still wasn't finished collecting unusual jobs. The Canadian Space Agency transformed one into a microgravity research aircraft. By flying a carefully controlled series of steep climbs and ballistic descents, scientists could experience 20 to 25 seconds of weightlessness inside what had once been a corporate cabin. Researchers floated. Experiments floated. Occasionally, so did stomach contents. There's a reason these airplanes earned the nickname Vomit Comet. Then, in 2012, the Falcon quietly added another first to its resume. It became the first civilian jet to fly using 100% unblended biofuel, made entirely from camelina, a plant related to mustard. A chased aircraft followed behind, measuring the exhaust and gathering data that would help shape future sustainable aviation research. Not bad for an airplane designed before Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. So, could you buy one today? Technically, yes. A few years ago, YouTuber Cletus McFarland purchased an abandoned Falcon 20 for around $15,000. That sounds like a bargain of the century, until reality showed up. The original General Electric engines are now too noisy to meet modern US regulations without expensive hush kits. Engine overhauls alone were quoted in the hundreds of thousands of dollars each. Landing gear needed rebuilding. Transportation wasn't cheap either. By the time the estimates were finished, that $15,000 airplane had become a multi-million-dollar restoration project. Sometimes there's a very good reason something seems like a bargain. And maybe that's the perfect way to remember the Falcon 20. It started life as an elegant French business jet, but somewhere along the way, it became a cargo hauler, a Coast Guard patrol aircraft, a military testbed, a zero-gravity laboratory, an environmental research platform, and one of the most versatile executive aircraft ever built. Not bad for an airplane that almost ended up being called the Mr. 20. And that wraps up another tale from aviation's stranger side. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies.